speaking about the race, I wanted to ask you, Shermichael. I was holding out this dream, this fantasy that neither Biden nor Trump would be the nominees. And I made that prediction about 15 months ago, as Carrie knows all too well. And I will admit that it's looking less and less likely that my dream will come to fruition, because I think that Biden's too old. Trump, we don't even need to get into it. So the American people, frankly, deserve better. Over 70% of us want a different choice, but our dysfunctional political system is cramming it down our throats anyway. So what say you? Is there any chance that we might be spared either Biden or Trump?
You know, Dave, I share in your frustration and maybe even anger with some Americans who are just tired of the entire process. But I do believe it'll be a rematch, a 2020 rematch. And based on the polls, I mean, I think Donald Trump's approval with Republicans have steadily increased beyond his 40% of the party because Republicans are starting to realize he is likely to be the nominee. And there's a considerable amount of data and surveys that have come out over the past several months now that indicate that he actually has the best chance to beat President Biden. And now there's recent data over the past 2 weeks that showcase he's ahead of Biden by a couple points, depending on which poll you're looking at, of course. And so those are all very positive things. Now, it's interesting because you go further into that data, you look at the cross tabulations. Many of these individuals who were looking for someone else other than Trump now believe he is the best person out of all of the other candidates to regain the White House. Now you look at some of the data regarding President Biden, and Democrats are not enthusiastic. He has a serious problem, particularly with voters of color. It was interesting. I was reading an Axios article that came out the day we're recording this, and it showcased that Biden's standing with white Democratic voters, with white independent-leaning Democratic voters, for the most part, is pretty stable. When you look at voters of color, he is suffering significantly. When you look at younger voters, he's suffering significantly. He's too old. People are upset about the state of the economy, although the White House continues to say inflation is decreasing, which the data, for the most part, does increase. It does indicate, rather, that the inflation overall has improved over the past several financial quarters, fiscal quarters. Jobs have indeed improved, but wages haven't increased to meet inflation. Gas prices are indeed going back up. The cost of living, if you're in a major city, have skyrocketed through the roof, and let alone if you're trying to buy a home. I mean, goodness gracious, I was lucky enough to buy my first home several months ago. But most of my friends who've done everything right, they went to college, they went off to get an advanced degree, they're hardworking, they're paying their bills, they're paying back their student loans, they cannot afford a home. And they're looking at President Biden and they're looking at Democrats, as most of them are not conservative like myself, and they're saying, you know, they promised that these things are going to improve. They did not. I'm not voting for Joe Biden. I'm just not going to vote. And some of them, particularly the guys, have said, you know, I'm going to give Trump my support. And so there's a lot of interesting variables and phenomenon here, David, to answer your question in terms of, do I think there will be someone else? I don't. And I think many Americans are starting to settle with the reality that it will be Trump and Biden. And they're trying to figure out, do I vote for Trump? Do I vote for Biden? Or do I just stay home? And I think if many stay home, that's an issue for Biden more so than it is for Trump.
What do you think, Carrie?
I agree with that. And what's interesting is the Trump campaign did some polling. John McLaughlin is a prominent pollster for Trump, and he found the buyer's remorse for Biden voters is about 7%, as in people who voted for him in 2020 and regret it, compared to only 2% for Trump, people who regret voting for Trump in 2020. So I agree with Shermichael that the enthusiasm is so way down for Biden, and that's a big problem. And it really is the economy, because yes, nominally inflation is down, but there's a metric called median CPI, which throws out the more extremes that drag the CPI in a direction that isn't realistic. And the median CPI is actually considerably higher than the top line CPI. And that's why the real pain is there, because that's hitting the median family, the average family. So as much as, Biden's spending all this money to buy an ad in the NFL debut to tout Bidenomics, I actually think it's a very tone deaf idea, because I think it's actually going to backfire and remind people how angry they are that their 401ks are dissipating. Their overall household net worth is down by between 5,600 to 7 or 8,000 on a median basis since Biden took office. So people are poor. They're less well off under Joe Biden. And I think that's why, as Shermichael said, especially with voters of color, it's the most vulnerable people who are left behind the most, because the consumer budget, which is most affected by inflation, that hits people of color, lower income, poor white families hardest, because they spend a bigger of their budget on consumption goods. And so that's why CNN had some polling showing that pretty much across the board, Biden's going to lose. Nikki Haley was actually the strongest. It was 49 Haley, 43 Biden. But Trump is beating Biden in CNN polling as well, 47-46. DeSantis is tied at 47. Pence, even Michael J. Pence, is winning against Joe Biden, 46-44. Tim Scott, 46-44 as well. Chris Christie, 44-42. So bad news for Biden. And then there's also the fact that only 30% of Americans agree with what Biden is doing on inflation. So there was an interesting little tidbit that I saw, that one of Biden's biographers actually said he wouldn't be surprised if Biden did step down. So I don't know if you saw that, Dave.
Well, I've seen a lot of rumors, but let me just say, God, there's so much to unpack here. First of all, national polls really don't mean a lot, because we all know it's a very closely divided country, and it's probably going to come down to 100, maybe 200,000 votes in 5 states. So I wouldn't pay attention to national polls. Secondly, yes, we can always talk about buyer's remorse with Biden, but you find me one person who didn't vote for Trump in 2020 who has a reason to vote for him in 24. I think those people are going to be fewer and further between than Biden voters who aren't going to vote for him this time. Thirdly, I hate it. Sometimes I hate being right. And we spoke on a previous show way back, Harry, about how a lot of Trump supporters who are now turning against him were only doing it because they thought he couldn't win. Forget the fact that he incited an insurrection, subverted the rule of law, tried to overturn a free and fair election, on and on and on, the nativism, the grievance, all that. Though, who cares about that? But if he can't win, then we'll get rid of him. But now that he can win again, maybe we'll bring him back on. And the final thing I would say is both parties are guilty of this. Betting on a weak horse because you think the other horse is weaker is a very iffy strategy. And that's what both sides are doing right now. And I think it's very clear that I think Gavin Newsom could beat Donald Trump, and I think Nikki Haley and frankly, many other Republican candidates could beat Joe Biden. And I would just caution the Biden administration, look at the votes of color. Why have Black voters, why have Latino voters drifted down from Biden? And this, by the way, was a trend that started last election. And these are people that Trump called drug dealers and rapists. So my message to Democrats is they're not running to Trump, they're running away from you, because Black and Latino voters are more pragmatic, they're more socially conservative. And when you're talking about kitchen table issues, as you were in 2018, they'll come and vote for you. When you're talking about the Green New Deal and defunding the police and confiscating guns and all this kind of stuff, no, they're not going to come to you. They're going to come away from you. So I think both parties are in a kind of a state of panic because they're stuck with nominees that they know are very vulnerable.